And one of the primary things that we strive to do when we get a dissertation or a research study off the ground is try to align the problem and the purpose and the question. A lot of times, some of the first things that you'll notice that committees focus on is, have you narrowed a problem? And is that problem something that is narrow enough to be researchable for a dissertation? And so that problem statement serves as the foundation of everything. So narrowing the problem is outside of the scope of this particular webinar, but stay tuned for some more. So I plan to also have a separate webinar on just narrowing to the problem statement. Because once you have the problem, then you can do what we're looking at today, which is then aligning a purpose statement with that problem and then aligning a research question or questions with that purpose. Notice it's always that sequence: problem, purpose, questions. Or you could see it as problem, foundation, purpose, questions. Sometimes the concept of that is called logical linear alignment. And sometimes you'll hear that from a committee member. Have you logically aligned the study? Is the problem and the purpose and the research question, are they aligned? Do they link up? Do they inform each other? Are they sort of tethered together? And a lot of times you do that through the language of the way you word the problem, purpose, and questions, and using a very consistent terminology among all three. So that's a little introduction to what this webinar is going to be about today. I'm Dr. Chris Deason. I'm a full professor at Full Sail University here in Orlando, Florida, specifically Winter Park, Florida. Been here for about 16 years with my family. I have a beautiful wife that we've been together now for over 25 years, and we have 3 children. We've raised them all here in Orlando. One's already moved off, so that's an interesting thing that's happened recently. And it was very hard to see one of my daughters move away, but I'm so happy for her that she's sort of found things that fulfill her life and are making her happy. Now she's living in New Mexico. So let's go ahead and with that, go ahead and get started. So if we think about any research endeavor, you're going to have to align the problem and the purpose and the questions. Well, where does that problem come from? It should come from the literature. And when you're working on a dissertation, it's very tempting to do something in a dissertation that you're very passionate about, or that you maybe have access to, or that you are you have a real personal interest in it. However, the problem comes in when the dissertation committee says, are you working on a dissertation in your field? So if you got a dissertation in clinical psychology, your problem should come from clinical psychology. And it should specifically come from the literature and journals within that field. So first we have to ground the study. In other words, grow it in the soil of the peer-reviewed literature within that particular academic domain. I've worked with many and coached and consulted with many writers over the past decade. And what I've noticed is many writers will try to choose or be in literature or choose a problem that is not really constrained with inside their degree program or their specific field. And then you run the risk of having your proposal sort of rejected because it's not aligning with the program of study and it's not aligning with the literature inside of that field. I remember working on my dissertation and asking one of my committee members what journals do you go to when you're doing research? And he gave me a list of about 10 journals. And that really cued me in on how these scholars do their work. And then when I started going to those journals, that's when I finally found something that I could make a contribution to, which was I finished my dissertation in 2008, and it was grounded in a study on reading motivation for fourth and fifth graders. I'm an instructional technologist. I work in the field of educational instructional technology. I teach in a master's degree at Full Sail on instructional design and technology. So I centered my dissertation around technology, and in this case, audio workstation technology, but particularly cultural relevancy. And what I noticed in the literature is that there, although there's a lot of research on culturally relevant pedagogy, using it in a way that I was using it for reading motivation and combined with hip hop culture. I could only find maybe 3 or 4 studies that had combined audio workstations and hip hop culture together. So that sort of gave me my gap. Committees are always talking about what is this gap you're trying to fill. Hence, once you really narrow to that problem, you can distill that gap and discover there may only be 2 or 3 people that have ever looked at that. Then you can start the alignment. So the problem statement really serves as the foundation of the research, and it has to be really well defined. It also needs to be very narrow. So if we look at the characteristics of a strong problem statement, you're going to find that it needs to be relevant, of course, to your field and to the gap that you're finding in the literature. It needs to be very clear. It needs to be a lot of clarity around it. And it needs to be very specific, because if it's not specific, you may end up doing 2 dissertations when you only had to do 1. I had that problem. I had a committee member tell me, don't have more than 2 questions. And I had 6. And she said, every time you add a question, add 3 months to your graduation. I was like, oh, but I still insisted on doing it anyway. And I learned my lesson when my dissertation ended up being 300 pages. So I didn't have to do that. I chose to do something that was very big in scope, and I hadn't really narrowed it enough. So that problem needs to get pretty narrow so it's realistic and achievable for you within a particular time frame. And that's why I want to emphasize the specificity that you're seeing on this slide when you are trying to narrow a problem statement. Once you have the relevance and clarity coming from the literature, then you got to sort of get specific. Once we have the problem statement, then we can write the purpose. And we could see the purpose is basically setting up the goals, showing us how significant the research is going to be, and sort of creating a boundary or the scope. So the purpose is going to tell us about basically what we hope to achieve. You know, sometimes you could call this, some institutions call it the aim of the study. Some have you write specific outcomes and objectives, but we can't have those outcomes and objectives without the problem. So now the problem gives us the purpose, and with the purpose, and I typically say, think about who, what, where, and how. Think about who the research participants are going to be, what it is that you're trying to achieve, where the study's taking place, and how you're actually going to get data. So all these things, the who, what, where, how, and the goals and objectives really set up the scope. So once you have the purpose, you know where the dissertation is going. Then the research questions are derived from that purpose statement. So notice the linkages that are starting to happen. Foundation at problem, purpose now tells us what we're going to do about that problem. And the research questions give us some different choices. Often the problem and purpose will sort of kind of push you towards particular questions, but it's the questions that then open up the door to what then becomes the theoretical or conceptual framework and ultimately the methodology and research design of the study. So notice how everything is sort of linked. So, but what the questions really do is help us really focus on the specific aspects of the study that came up in the problem and the purpose. So it's about really formulating questions that are clear and researchable within the particular problem space that you stated. And in some cases, that may be descriptive questions, things that could be more qualitative, more exploratory, phenomenological, narrative. It's the descriptive questions that sort of take us in that qualitative direction. And qualitative and just myself and Tess were just speaking right before we began today about the nature of qualitative research and why it's so needed. And in fact, without the qualitative and the descriptive type questions, there really is no context for quantitative research. It's the qualitative that provides the contextual clues and the context of the research. So when you're measuring things without any context for it, it doesn't really make sense. The data won't even make sense. But if your problem purpose leads you to comparative or causal questions, you're probably going to end up with more of a quantitative type study because you have some type of comparison, or you're trying to say that if you do this, then this will happen, sort of cause and effect. Or you could have relational type studies that would be using like correlations. These two things are related. We can't say that they're actually one causes the other, but they always happen together. So you're going to have a lot of once you've developed your research questions, now you're going to start going down a path, and then it begins. So what I wanted to do today is to one, just express how you can be really playful with research by using your research imagination to sort of think visually about the issues going on in your study, seeing them sort of as a triad or three, and for conceiving and aligning the problem, purpose, and questions. There's a lot of visuals that we could use to sort of come up with a conceptualization of the alignment process. So what I'm hoping is that your walkaway, one of the walkaways I hope you get from this is just the ability to just use your imagination, be playful with finding your dissertation topic and aligning your study. You know, don't take it so seriously that impede your own ability to be open and creative when you're first formulating your study. Because you want the study to be something that carries you through the dissertation process and beyond. Could be a stepping stone to sort of the next thing you're going to do. So and you want to be motivated during the process. So it needs to be something that will sustain your motivation and engagement for an extended period of time, usually at least a year, to, work on a dissertation. So let's think about this idea of alignment. So in a way, what it does is aligning the problem and the purpose and the questions basically allows you to create this cohesiveness. And it's also the logic. This cohesiveness is created by the logic of sort of using the same verbiage and terminology and concepts among the problem, the purpose, and the questions. And when I'm working with my dissertation writers, I often have them, once they have the problem statement, just copy and paste to create the purpose, but changing the purpose to what you're going to do about that problem. And then copy and paste the purpose and turn it into a question. Then you can guarantee, based on the alignment of the terminology, that you're going to have a cohesive dissertation. And that's why it's so important to really narrow that problem before you do this, or you'll wind up going down a road where you've taken on more than you really have to. So let's think about this metaphor of a lock. And in 2016, I was doing a study on cyberbullying. And I noticed that there was a lot of research on cyberbullying, but it was primarily just focused on victimization and perpetrators. There wasn't a lot about the classroom environment. So I started considering what's coming up in the literature on classroom environment. And what I discovered is there was only about 5 or 6 researchers that had even looked at the systemic effects of cyberbullying inside classrooms and schools, and how it sort of is like a ripple effect starting in the classroom and can really permeate the entire system in a very toxic way. So the problem I narrowed finally was, no one had really looked at the nature of reported cyberbullying based on teachers' perceptions and the key factors around these teachers' perceptions that impact the classroom environment. So what I want you to notice is that these metaphors can be used sort of in a very creative, playful way to think about the nature of your own study. So notice here, I've narrowed down to a problem, and I'm starting to see really 3 things. There's things that are missing in key factors of cyberbullying in classroom environments. The whole nature of it, based on teachers' perceptions, is missing. And just like the linear alignment that we were just referring to, notice this lock is a way to see your problem and purpose and your questions. You've got to lock it in. The language needs to be similar, if not identical, among all 3. The difference will be the problem will be an issue that has an impact on others or organizations. It's also probably a deficiency in the literature, so there's the gap. And once you have that problem, you can lock it in by using the same terminology to write the purpose, which is what you're going to do about that problem and the specificity around that. And then the research questions are going to be basically focus in on the path that you're going to end up taking. And ultimately, you're going to have to answer those questions. But notice, it's all the questions come from that alignment. So if we start at the question level instead of the problem level, then we are trying to retrofit the peer-reviewed literature to what we want. That's problematic. You could spend more time trying to retrofit the existing literature to what you want to do with your questions, rather than just looking at the literature, getting a problem from the literature or a recommendation for future research, which is always really helpful, because a lot of times those recommendations hone us in on a very specific problem, and it's a gap and it's a limitation in their study, and they're basically just handing you a dissertation. So it all begins at the problem. Then we can lock in the purpose. Then we can lock in the questions. Let's think about it now as a funnel. So notice at the top of the funnel is all the literature in your field that you've identified, discovered a gap, and formulated a specific problem. So that's up at the top of this funnel. That then allows us to get a little more narrow, and then we can have our purpose. Then we can get a little more narrow, and here we have our research questions. Ultimately, those questions are now focused and relevant, and now you can get busy with your study. Using my example of cyberbullying, I started looking at all the literature I could on cyberbullying's impact on classrooms and classroom systems. Then that allowed me to identify the problem, which was, classrooms are deeply impacted by cyberbullying, and it's a huge issue that has systemic effects in classrooms and for teachers and for the entire school system. It's a very systemic thing. Then I was able to really state my purpose, which was to start exploring these teachers' perceptions about the impact, because there was so little literature. It's best to start with the qualitative, to start exploring it a little bit and build the context before jumping in with trying to measure something. And then that allowed me to formulate my research questions about these teachers' perceptions. So a funnel is a great metaphor for understanding how to get a study off the ground by aligning the problem, purpose, and questions. It's also a great metaphor for narrowing the problem, which is the foundation of this alignment. You're going to find a lot of general, broad literature, but you're going to have to start funneling it down to something specific to make your dissertation realistic within a time frame that is feasible, set forth by you and the program. We could think about it like a knot. It's all just knotted together. So the problem and the purpose and the questions should be inconceivably like they come together. You should be able to see them as just locking in. And this knot metaphor, it's almost like, if you think imaginatively, it's like weaving something or taking a thread and sort of weaving it through. So that needle and thread is that problem statement, which then is woven into the fabric of the purpose, and which is then woven into the fabric that develops the question. So if we're thinking about my cyberbullying example over here on the right side of the screen, all these things sort of lock in. This impact on classroom, the nature of reported cyberbullying, and teachers' perceptions. These are the things that are going to be investigated. We currently, in 2016, that is, teachers' perceptions were almost completely missing on how cyberbullying and the nature of it, and getting and reporting from teachers themselves, and the impact that it was making on their classrooms. So by thinking of your study and the factors around it, you can see how something like a metaphor of a knot is not only useful for aligning problem, purpose, and questions, but for seeing how things that are now coming up in your study are related. So again, it's this playfulness of thinking about visual images and how to get everything to not in. I often use a pyramid metaphor when I'm providing, working with my dissertation writers and coaching and consulting them, because I want them to understand that if you're building a pyramid or a home, the most important aspect of it is the foundation. And if the foundation isn't there, there won't be a purpose. There won't be any questions. So when I was looking at cyberbullying, I had to really get into the literature and find that missing stuff. There was just so much research about victimization and perpetration, but very few people had even looked at teachers' perceptions of the impact in classrooms and schools. So now I've got a foundation to start writing the problem statement from. And then from the problem statement, I can write my purpose. And then from the purpose, I can write the question. So a pyramid is a great metaphor to sort of play with in your mind, thinking about how the study comes together. What's nice is you can even use visuals in your paper like this, which will then help your committee understand how everything's linked together, and that you understand that. You understand how this triad of problem, purpose, and question is actually vital to getting a dissertation off the ground and progressing and moving forward. So think pyramid and let that problem be the foundation. We can use like a arc, and if we think about a rainbow, or we think about an electrical arc, or this idea that it's sort of it's connected. The problem statement could, in there's no particular order, but notice problem, purpose, question. Then we could kind of continue this arc right after the question. Ooh, what's the theoretical framework? Ooh, what methodology and research design will inform and provide answers to these research questions? So it's almost like the beginning of a circle where you're seeing an entire process of a dissertation emerging. And that could come full circle back to the problem, which ultimately you are now addressing, which is now going to fit very nicely into the literature. And in a way, you should already know who your colleagues are that are going to read your dissertation just based on the problem statement. Because once you've identified the gap and the few researchers that have gotten close to your gap, you already know who your primary readers are for your dissertation. So it kind of comes full circle. Problem. Well, first find gap, problem, purpose, question, theoretical, methodology and research design. Answer that. And it comes back to another problem. So you can see the beginning of this arc almost being like a cyclical research process. Considering the cyberbullying in classrooms, you have, I can represent teachers' perceptions on here, and the classroom system, and then the classroom environment, and the student-teacher relations. So from my problem, I can now even, once I have that problem, purpose, and questions aligned, I can now use this sort of arc to sort of think about how the factors of the study are going to work. So I know I'm going to be exploring teachers' perceptions qualitatively. I know this is going to be exploring cyberbullying's impact on classroom environment and student-teacher relations. That gives you an indicator about the research questions. And it's going to be the impact on the system. So you see how these things, you can use these visuals as a way to, once you have a problem, you can align the problem, purpose, and questions, and you can also use these visual metaphors for teasing out how the research questions work and what you're going to explore. So these visual images can be very helpful in just allowing you to use your creative imagination and play around with your topic. And it's a great time to get feedback from committee members in this process because they can see how what you're doing, trying to get all these things aligned to get your study off the ground. You're really showing them the processes that you're going through. You can think about this like a triad: problem, purpose, questions, sort of a cyclical type thing. So in a way, it doesn't matter exactly what sequence we start on the triad. We could have put the problem statement on the right, but what we're really doing is trying to lock it all in, lock those three factors in. So it might be helpful to think about a triad or just a triangle when getting the problem, purpose, and research questions aligned. And again, now this triangle allows me to play around with what I'm going to now do in my study. I'm going to be looking at the nature of reported cyberbullying using teachers' perceptions to look at the impact. So let's try it as an interesting way that you could, bring your alignment to your committee chair or advisor and start discussing with them, hey, these are the things I'm thinking I'm going to explore in this. And I say explore because this was a qualitative study that I did. Because of the limited data on teachers, on the systemic impacts of cyberbullying in classrooms, I felt it best to begin with exploratory research to start building the context before trying to measure something. I call this formulation. The idea that if you're going to formulate your study, you're going to need to align the problem, purpose, and question. So that formulation is going to come from the literature in your field. So when you're trying to formulate your alignment or formulate the topic of your study, formulate your dissertation, that research formulation begins with the literature in your field, which is why it's so important to know what some of the major journals are in your specific field. So that way you can really make sure that you ground and formulate your study from the known literature inside of your field. Then you can work on the alignment once you understand that gap inside of that literature. So if we think about this image on the right-hand side of the screen, again, this is my cyberbullying example. And sort of this formulation lets me start sort of looking at what I need to unpack here. I'm going to be looking at cyberbullying classroom environments, and I need to explore its impact on classroom members and its effect on student-teacher relations and its influence on classroom systems in general. And in a way, what this could be giving me is the sub-research questions of my qualitative central question. Now, I want to make sure that we dig into some specifics here. So I need to understand what's going on based on teachers' perceptions of the impact in their classroom and how it's impacting relationships and what the teachers feel is the overall influence on the classroom system and even school. So formulating something gives us, starting with something like the literature, then we can formulate problem, purpose, and questions. We've seen like Venn diagrams and nesting and circles can be, very effective in helping us see things. And inside of this, you can see that, notice that everything is contained within the problem statement. This is why you can't start a study with research questions. And you can't begin with the purpose. Because the purpose is nested inside of the problem. And the questions are nested inside of the purpose. But the core issue is the problem. And we have to address the core issue first, then define the research intent, then make questions that are going to guide us onto a pathway, usually a quantitative pathway, a qualitative pathway, or a mixed methods pathway. I often hear writers say, I'm not really good at statistics, but I've got to do a qualitative study. So I've just got to, but really the central issue isn't the methodology and research design. It still comes back to what is the core issue and the problem? What is the gap in the research? Then it's up to us to serve the field at the core issues of things that are missing in the literature. So notice how I kind of use nesting here on the right-hand side. So problem statement in this case, there's really a lack of literature, and we really haven't examined the nature and impact of cyberbullying in classrooms. So notice that is sort of the foundation, and what's stuck on that is the purpose. Now we need to explore these teachers' perceptions. Then the question emerges. Look at the teachers' perceptions and the impacts of cyberbullying in classroom systems. But notice, problem is at the core. This is another helpful metaphor. Be creative about alignment, just thinking about links. They have to lock in. And one of the best ways to do that is just through language. You use the same terminology. And I'm going to show you an example of that at the end of the slides as a way I narrowed my problem and then aligned it for this topic of cyberbullying. So notice these links also are really helpful in understanding, now that I have a problem, what am I going to do? So it starts pointing to the purpose and the questions. So I'm going to explore the nature of reported cyberbullying inside of classrooms using teachers' perceptions. So in a way, these visual metaphors can even help us write our purpose statement once we have a problem, or help us come up with and generate the questions that are inherently tied into the purpose. You might see this idea of pillars, like it's how do you create a structure that you can work with throughout your dissertation process. So column 1, problem. Column 2, purpose. Column 3, questions. Now we have 3 components that are aligned, and we've built the edifice of a structure that we can now work with that will hopefully sustain us through our dissertation process. And again, notice how I use the visual and cyberbullying in classrooms to start playing with what now this study is. I need to explore the nature of reported cyberbullying based on teachers' perceptions and the impact that it's making on classrooms. Really useful for helping us develop the purpose and questions. Could also think about alignment on a spectrum. So good alignment and good formulation means there is a clear purpose based on a problem that leads to the research questions. Everything aligns. Or poor alignment, where you see the problem says this, but then it kind of changes on the purpose. And then from the purpose to the questions really aren't addressing the purpose. So then you have misalignment. But what you're striving for is good formulation, good alignment. Formulation beginning at the level of the literature and narrowing to a specific problem, then writing the purpose, then writing the questions. Now everything is locked in and aligned. So if you look over here on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll notice that the problem is the negative impact that cyberbullying has on classroom members. That's what I found in the literature from an author by the name of Willard. And she had done extensive research and actually released some really long summative reports on it. So Dr. Willard sort of let me know that there's not a lot out there on looking at the negative impact that cyberbullying is having inside of the classroom system and on members and on disruptions and how it overall impacts the system. So now I was able to ground this problem inside the literature. Now, to be aligned, I need to explore the nature of reported cyberbullying on classroom members. I need to look at teachers' perceptions of student-teacher relations. I need to look at the impact of the classroom environment. Why? Because that's what the problem statement told me I'm going to do. We don't always just get a carte blanche choice of what we're doing. Our job as scholars and as doctors are to serve. Who do we serve? We serve the journals. We serve the knowledge of our field. And it's our job to serve that field now by addressing things that are really important and that are currently missing from the literature. Now, notice I can formulate my questions on cyberbullying in classroom environments by getting the teacher's perspectives, by asking about the classroom dynamics and how it's impacting the system. So everything locks in. So by aligning the problem, the purpose, and the questions, you're going to have a super strong foundation and be able to argue your study. And by ensuring these components are connected, you can really create a study that makes a significant impact. Even if it's only a small thing, it's going to make a significant impact on the field because your research is going to fit like a puzzle piece into the body of the literature in your field. So this alignment not only enhances the quality of the research, but it increases the relevance and the applicability of it in scholarly literature and real-world contexts. Before that, I will actually want to stop sharing for just a moment, and I'm going to show you this alignment that I created for this cyberbullying study I worked on in 2016. So let me stop sharing for just a moment. And I want to share this document with you. So one of the first things I do when I'm working in coaching and consulting with dissertation writers is, particularly when you're starting at the beginning, is I have them use that funnel metaphor for sort of narrowing the problem. So there's the big stuff that we're not going to do anything about because it's so big and vast, it would take a lifetime to do something about it. Then I'm going to try to anchor the problem in so it starts narrowing to something that I can do something about. And finally, I arrived at classroom environment. And I could have chosen a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approach, but without a lot of data, it's better to build context. So we need to move to the qualitative literature. Now we can distill the gap. And I only found 5 researchers that had looked on classroom systems of cyberbullying. Now I can align it. And I want you to notice the nature of the terminology. So the problem gives us the foundation. So exploring the nature of reported cyberbullying in classroom environment and teachers' perceptions of the impacts on classroom environment is important due to the negative impact that cyberbullying has on its classroom members, student-teacher relations, and the classroom system as a whole. Now, I literally copied this problem and pasted it and turned it into the purpose. So the purpose of my study will be to explore the nature of reported cyberbullying in classroom environments. I didn't finish reading the details, but it is exactly the same as the problem. Then I took the purpose and I copied and pasted it, and I turned the purpose into the question. Now the study's aligned.